Thank you very much, Dr. Raman. Um, Yes, I was also doing some work with Kerala, and I have been doing some work with the government last couple of years. And I know that during the big flooding in 2018, there was a lot of focus on um, migrants from other states, and yet, in fact, it wasn't really we didn't do you know enough of the surveys that were needed to understand the plight of those people, and the government was proactive in that area, but it hasn't been documented enough, I think, outside. So that would be something to keep on our radar screen, the role of host communities, and that would be very, very beneficial to the migrants from Orissa, Bihar, UP, and MP. Also, another aspect is in the context of Kerala, the complete focus on migrants from Kerala in the GCC countries, which is elements of internal migration, although it is not. It is international migration. Um, there is that link between, and I think Rajan has done a lot of work in this area, between internal migration and then international migration, the cascading migration, as they say, some people say, or step-by-step migration. You first move somewhere and then move out from somewhere. Bob Lucas has also looked into this, I understand. Anyways, I would like to open the floor for questions or comments, but Rajan, do you have anything further to add? Anything I'm missing?
No, Dilip, let us listen from the other people who are participating right now.
Great.
I'll come
so we have about 15 minutes. And what we could do is to take 3 questions, if that is okay. First, we take 3 questions, and then we will give it to the panelists. And that way, we will be more efficient. Otherwise, if we go one by one, it will be 1 question and 5 panelists, and I'll shut up. So with that, there is a way to raise hands. If you hover your mouse on your name, you can raise hand. So, or just speak up, please. So the floor is open for questions. And I see Mr. Singh and Shabari, my great friend out there. Great to see you.
And Lucas.
Okay. Oh, great. And Bob Lucas. So I don't know who raised their hands first, and then Sonia. So I see 4 hands, but I would like to first give the floor to Mr. Singh, and then Shabari, and then that is Mr. Nair, and then Bob Lucas, and then Sonia. That is okay with you. And let's go with the 4 questions, and then we will give a chance to the panelists. Mr. Singh.
Yeah. Good evening to everyone. I know many of you. Rajan is my colleague from IPS days. Internal migration actually in India, and this epidemic has made one of the most vulnerable group migrant. As you all know that what happened to them, some and more news type of things. Also, I experienced that in the rural area, whoever went back, initially they were provided some kind of support like ration and all this one, but later they were left like as earlier they have to fend themselves. So there is a need now, because also the work, and a lot of I just wrote in the chat, a lot of corruption is going on in the name of supporting that migrant. A lot of people, like those local people, they're exploiting without any work, the kind of sharing money. So there is a need now. In fact, now also I went recently to UP, and I experienced myself that kind of you have to have the corona report and all this one, and you have to share the money. You have to share the money to get a negative report. So I feel that there's somewhere government has to think, because most sufferers are migrant. They run from the rural area or other places to urban area to get the work done, so that they can survive. And those type of things is not taken by anyone. Everyone just simply say that they are supporting, but in reality, as I experienced in Bombay, also those daily wage workers, they don't have any work. And time to time, they just stop that their work in the terms of lockdown and all this one. So these people, how to help? There are no one, like people say that in Delhi, they run that kitchen and blah, blah, so many things. But it is also just what is called just 5%, 10%. A big chunk of that group is left without any support. And somehow they, you can see that what is happening all over. So, in fact, sometime back, Professor Kundu and all this one, they were telling that sample survey will be taken towards all this daily wage worker and all this. I don't think they have started at all. Anyway, this our Irudharajan can highlight some of the progress made on this stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh. I'm glad you mentioned Rajan by name because that helps a lot in the panel, but others can also join in. Shabri?
Thank you very much, Dilip. What an absolute pleasure, also because this comes under the aegis of KNOMAD, and it takes me back to the conversation that you, Sonia, myself, Beata, and a lot of people sat down a decade back, almost a decade back on the shores of Lake Geneva. It almost feels historic to now be in a conversation on internal migration coming from there. But this is fantastic. This is a great opportunity, and to give if Aryan Dehan is actually Arjun De, then we really have a group of eminent
Shabri, we lost you a bit. Please go ahead. Please continue. Oh, we lost him.
Yeah, Dilip, we can come back. Go to the next one.
Yes. Bob Lucas. Muted.
Just a couple of very quick points on data in India. The National Sample Survey does not report place of birth, which makes comparisons with most other data sources in the world impossible. I gather the census does report place of birth, but the microdata from the census are not available to anyone outside of the country, as far as I can see. Though I gather a couple of people at the World Bank managed to get their hands on those data. My own numbers I got out of the National Sample Survey at least 2007-8. I'm not sure if there's been a more recent migration round. A couple of points that come out of that. It's often been said that rural-urban migration is notably low in India. These data show that it is not low by international standards. And indeed, the rural-urban migration by women is exceptionally high in India, despite, as Priya pointed out, the lack of work for women in the cities. Short-term migration is often said to be extremely high in India. The NSS data show that it is not. It's actually about the median for most developing countries. So I'm not sure where that impression comes from. The issue has been mentioned of marriage, of migration for marriage. I would point out that if any couple are going to get married, one of them is usually going to have to migrate if they want to live together. The issue is how far do you move? I don't understand why in India there is such a massive focus on migration for marriage. It is rarely discussed anywhere else in the world. And the last point that came up in the discussion, definition of urbanization. If my memory is correct, looking at the geospatial data, India is not far out in their definition of urban, but I think there's a good deal more work could be done with those geospatial data. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Shabri, we lost you a bit, so if you could.
Yeah. My apologies. electricity problems in Delhi. Here's some quick perspectives from my side based on what I've heard. I think what is really special about this also, Dilip, is the complementarity that this particular brief brings to the work that the ILO embarked on last year. So in December 2020, we launched a report titled Roadmap for Developing a Policy Framework for the Inclusion of Internal Migrant Workers in India. And this roadmap actually had the likes of Ravi Raman and Priya Deshinkar and Professor Bhagat as a part of an advisory panel. And it was co-authored by ILO, Ajivika Bureau, and CMI. I allude to this document because this document is now being used by Niti Aayog in the development of their national policy, or the national policy that the central government wants to take into consideration. As a follow-up to this, and something that Dr. Ravi Raman pointed out, I want to extract the element of the importance of the employer's role. It is really one that we are understating in these conversations. At the end of the day, no matter whatever happens in the context of government policy discussions, if we do not recognize the role of private sector, the employers' organizations, and the businesses, I think we would be really doing a disservice to this particular issue. And I'm glad that Dr. Ravi Raman pointed out that particular aspect. Within that context, just one point on that, and that is to say that there is now an entire conversation on building trust and workers. And this trust building exercise is one that the ILO is called, as you know, Dilip, in our tripartite format. So this trust building exercise is one that employers feel that they need to now rework themselves on so that they don't lose out on such a tremendous policy perspective that employers themselves have to contribute to. Thanks, Dilip. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shabari. Sonia?
Thank you, Dilip, and so nice to see everybody. I have three questions very quickly. The first question to Arjan, because your historical perspective brings me to think what if you can bring the question, what is different from this phase from this COVID pandemic from the previous return that you have mentioned in 1929 or something? What is different maybe is the global, the volume, what lessons we can extract from that. That's one. The second one, when Professor Lucas, a little bit, when we were doing an analysis when the census 2017 came in India, and we were looking at some of the motives of the reasons, basically what we found it, and that's what you say, why you focus too much on migration for marriage, because when you analyze the responses from women in that census respond, they only moving because of marriage. No, so that's why it's the kind of things there was not so much mobility for women. I don't know. This is what the response on the census. Now, Priya is saying that there's some mobility that women are moving, and then we have to capture that better data on the women that are moving to support the households, or maybe moving. Dilly was mentioning me that women are the ones and the child doing the brickles. So we have to analyze that. But for me, the most important thing will be, and nobody has listened, how we entangle all the universal access, all the bank accounts that India has been given to everybody in the States, all the policies that has been given to distribute the social protection, and all the work that it has been doing on universal IDs. How we link this to put this into these programs to disperse and support the migrants. And then on the point of Chabari, on access to private sector, I think access to markets and the private sector, I think that we have a big role to play right now, because we have to rebuild back better after COVID. And I think this is the trust that you mentioned on private sector and the workers. And also the element that Priya was saying, the intermediaries on access to credit, access to finance, access to service, and also the internal recruiters. No, the internal recruiters, I think that the cost of internal recruiters has also increased. So I would like to have a little bit more learning from the experience of India. Over to all the panelists. Thank you, Dilip.
Thank you. So I would call on each of the panelists to kind of keep it brief, and I'm going to call on you because that's the most efficient way. It seems like we have about 3 minutes left. If it is okay with everyone, we can extend by 5 minutes more. So Rajan, over to you, and please keep it brief. Can't hear you.
I want to pick up only 2 points. I don't want, because I think my other speakers will pick it up. One is about corruption. I think that is something we should look at it very, very carefully, because when I was doing some work on tsunami in Tamil Nadu some time back, people who are benefited by tsunami is not the tsunami people, but the other people are benefited in the name of tsunami. If that is happening in the name of migrants, the COVID-19, I think it has to be documented. I think there's something, in fact, there's something eye-opener on that. These certificates, new market. In fact, somebody told me, now this e-pass is sold. If I want to go to Tamil Nadu, I need an e-pass. Somebody said, give me 300 rupees, I'll get an e-pass. So I think this new business, new corruptions in the name of COVID mobility, I think that has to be looked at it very, very carefully. And the second point, the definition of the migration. Even you look at it as Lucas says, in census, you have only 2 definitions in India: place of birth and place of last residence. Even you take place of birth, where were you born? They say, I'm not born in Delhi. Then you are a migrant. I am from other states. So that itself indicates that in India had 400 million people in 2011. And every 10 years, we are adding close to 150 to 170 million. I added another 3 million because in the current government, last 7 years, they were promoting smart cities. Smart city means migration. So they are accelerating migration. That's why we put some type of approximation of 600 million. You can use place of birth. That's the best data. You can get it from census. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan. Priya?
Yeah, just to say that there's been lots of interesting ideas flowing around, and the things that particularly struck me was the need to really look at this nexus between the state, employers, and migrants, and of course intermediaries somewhere in between. And we need to really understand the nature of governance, or theorize that, as Dr. Raman said. That is quite important, to compare how different states have responded to the whole situation, and what they have or have not done for migrants and why. And I think, examining the role of employers in detail is also important, as Shabari mentioned, because that isn't talked about enough, their responsibility towards their workers, or what can be done to build trust. I agree that trust is important, but there's a whole profit question here as well, which I was trying to allude to, which is this whole issue of the race to the bottom. If they're trying to work with smaller and smaller margins to compete with each other, then all of that is passed down to the workers, and that is something that we need to talk about as well. How far can you continue that race to the bottom? How far can you carry on passing those losses or those precarities onto workers, and why there isn't sufficient state protection when that kind of hyper precarity is arising. So, and very finally, thank you, Bob, for raising those questions on urbanization, etc. I got my figures mainly from David Satterthwaite's work. He's compared urbanization levels all over the world, and he actually raised the question about India's definition of urban quite some time ago. So that's where that comes from. And as to the focus on marriage and migration, God only knows why India is obsessing about that, because there's so much migration of women happening outside of marriage as well. And that's what I was trying to actually draw attention to. So thank you very much. It was a great meeting.
Thank you, Priya. Dr. Dehan?
Thanks very much. Let me lots of interesting questions. Let me focus on Sonia's question, and then I'll send you the article that I wrote about it, what's different from the early ones of earlier crises. Of course, the volume is different, right? That's just more people moving. I would emphasize it's not actually, if you look at the importance for the rural areas, it's not actually that larger, as Arvind does highlight in his historical studies of Bihar, for example. He said in the poor areas that 1 out of 2 households had a migrant. This is 100 years ago. And I always say, like, I don't have any evidence that actually, in that sense, actually changed over time. So in terms of the importance for rural areas, it hasn't changed that much. I think the second thing to look at how it's different, and very much also picking up Sabri's point, it was like we have to talk more about the employers. But it is. Employers in the colonial and the large industries did take some responsibilities for its migrant workers, but never to settle families in cities. It was the housing that was provided, the investments. It was always based on the assumption that migrants would go back to the rural areas if jobs disappeared. That was a given assumption. And I think, and that's where, for me, not much has changed over that period. If you take the state's responsibility, there is that same assumption of if there is a crisis, migrants will just go back. The colonial officer Gilchrist wrote in 1931 is that migrants disappeared like snow for the sun. There was a clear assumption that there was no responsibility to take on that responsibility, either by employers or the state. In 2020, I feel it's even worse. The colonial officers in 1931 knew that there were trains carrying the migrants back to their villages, and the fact that trains were cancelled. That's what I'm saying. It's like I don't understand that. It makes it worse, and clearly indicates to me that in those policies there was a complete and utter disregard of the fate of the workers. It was with the cancellation of the trains, it was, yes, you don't want people to move, but everybody who knew this knew that people would be moving back because they just had no place in the cities, and even that option was taken away by the way that the COVID policies were put in place.
Thank you, Dr. Han. Dr. Raman.
Yeah, thanks, Dilip. I just wish to add just one point to Sabri and Priya. Thanks, of course. I would obviously agree with them when they highlight this question of trust. I do really agree with them, and I must also be thankful to Sabri for bringing out that roadmap that has come out well. In fact, he was the one who took the initiative for that. What I'm trying to say is that, I mean, this trust, that doesn't mean that it should be left to the neoliberal labor market. That's my point. Okay, we need to build up trust. But I mean, if you leave this to the neoliberal labor market, then it's not going to work. So my point is that, agree that we need to build trust, but at the same time, it should be fully backed by legal norms. There should be a well-defined legal framework. I mean, with respect to the relations between these three forces, at least, that is the three agencies, the state, the employers, and the migrants. And as part of that, as part of building this trust, I would also raise the point of what is called the question of culture. That's important. And that's specifically one of the reasons why we in Kerala call them as guest workers. I know that it is a point of contentious sort of things. And I know that ILO may not be that happy about that, but we call them guest workers because we really want to honor them. And that's the first step of protecting the migrant workers. We need to honor them, and then we need to protect, or we need to help them claim their basic rights. That's the point. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to give the floor to Dr. A, I understand, or Mr. A. There was a question and I don't have time. If it is a 30-second intervention, you could do that.
Hi, Mr. Deep. My name is Anuja. Sorry, I entered with my initials, so that was an issue. Yeah, I am an independent journalist based in Delhi. I wanted to ask what the panelists feel could be the likely medium or long-term impact of the pandemic on the migratory patterns of women workers in India. There are some anecdotal evidence which shows that lesser women and families could be migrating, mostly due to the still raging pandemic. But do the panelists feel it is a temporary kind of trend, or do you think there could be any long-term impact?
I don't know if there is time for that. So what I would like to do is take that as a comment, and we would probably respond somehow, maybe through a blog or some mechanism. There was also a hand raised by Yogada Joshi. If you could make a quick intervention, please. We are beyond time now, so.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have two questions. One is that can the government's deliberate attempt to create employment in rural areas in India help reduce distress-driven migration? That's one. And secondly, and this could also be with respect to smaller towns. Yeah, from where the migrants move out. Then the second question is that how rapid are migration trends in India? That is, if a survey is conducted, say every 10 years, will this be up-to-date information for the government to be to use it for policy making and beneficiary identification for development programs? So yeah, basically the pace of migration trends. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogada. We again don't need to answer I'm not going to ask the panelists because we don't have time, but we noted the question. Sonia, do you want to give a quick 1 minute update on what is coming up in the thematic working group on internal migration, the KNOMAD thematic working group?
Thank you very much. Yes, we have a very heavy agenda ahead of time, and then it will respond some of the questions that people have been asking, especially Anuja and others, what happened with the impact of COVID. We are undertaking 4 surveys in 2 cities in each country, and additional 5 more to measure the impact of COVID on internal migration on different aspects, access to social service, education, health, what has been the response of the local government, the federal government, the country on those of what, so we can make a comparative study. At this point, we are going to do 2 cities in India and in Peru, and we're looking at other countries that have been an internal migration, and at the end, we were going to have a comparative study how COVID has impacted internal migration. We are also doing another policy brief on China, internal migration on China. So we can have also comparative analysis of what happened in India, China, we have done West Africa and East Africa. So for the time being, stay tuned to get this data, because as we have come out as a conclusion from this meeting, is that we need clear data. As Yogita has put in now, what is the basis that we do the registry for being provided access to services if we don't have the basic data on internal migration, data on the impact, and look at this from the perspective across countries. Over to you, Dilip. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone. Very packed session, very informative, substantive session. Clearly a very important topic. I wanted to add a couple of thoughts very quickly. One is that is it really true that mobility restrictions are much relaxed or lower, weaker in India for internal migration? Or is it that India is a country of 35 different countries, and if not anything, the language barrier itself is a huge issue, and then of course the dons and the criminals, right? I mean, you want to go and set up in Dharavi, no way, right? So this is a question that always comes to my mind. Is it true that entry barriers for internal migration are lower, mobility restrictions are lower, or not? There's a second point. India, again, population of 1.4 billion, right? That's larger than the population of Africa. And Africa has 54, or is it 55 countries now? And what we know in Africa is that, international migration within Africa, about 2/3 or 70% of international migration is actually intra-Africa migration within Africa. And now 600 million in India seems to be inching towards that, meaning quite large. So there is an interesting point. Is really mobility that low in India, or is it? And if it is, then is it because of the mobility restrictions? Something to think about. But again, not to answer questions, I'm not the expert. The topic is very, very important, and it's going to get even way more important with the climate change issues coming up. And we always say that with climate change, people will be moving mostly within the countries. Internal migration, internal displacement will increase. But think about all the small countries or smaller countries or small island nations. Any migration there is international. And the good thing is that that issue itself has its own solution. If it is a small country, it's not a large problem, right? You can always accommodate them. The world is a large place. So with those thoughts, more to think about. Thank you everyone for the participation in the event, and we will have more events like this going forward. Thanks a lot to the panelists. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you, Dilip.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
So
Bye.
much. Yeah, thank you.